there are many of these developing countries that really will be happy to use the digital RMB if it's cheap and effective because they're cut off from dollars.
We look at the United States as the #1 exporter to the Caribbean region. However, like you said, most of those products are actually made in China. And so you could essentially eliminate this middleman.
The biggest thing that central bank digital currencies will be known for, what they'll be famous for, what they'll be remembered for, will be bringing financial inclusion to unbanked populations. The dollar is the largest in trade, no question about it. But what we can start to question is it the easiest currency for many developing countries to use and access? And the answer is no.
All right, everybody, I'm very honored to welcome once again back to the channel, Richard Turrin. Richard, how are you today? Cyrus,
I'm great because I'm here with you and visiting with your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Richard, you've turned out to be one of our favorite guests here on the show, and I love our chats that we get to have. They're very real, and what's really nice is just our ability just to have a nice conversation about China and its role around the world as we're watching the digital currency being rolled out. We see China building its relationships with countries around the world, and that's basically the two things that I'm going to focus on in today's episode. The title today is how America is pushing Caribbean nations closer to China. And this is a really interesting topic to discuss because it most definitely involves China's digital currency. For everybody that is new to the show, if this is your first video that you have watched on my channel, or if this is the first time that you've seen Richard as one of my guests, I'm going to invite you to, first of all, watch our very first episode together. We did about a 45-minute deep dive into China's central bank digital currency. It was a very well received video on this channel. Many comments, a lot of great feedback from people. To be honest, Richard really just broke it down from A to Z. Everything you need to know about China's digital bank currency. And it does actually show that there's a lot of interest in this. And again, I think if we go back to that first episode, you really broke down why it is so important and how this is really going to potentially change banking in the future. What has America been doing in the Caribbean? What is the recent trend that we've seen with America pulling out?
Okay, so there's sort of two separate questions here, and let me just tease them out.
Yeah.
The first one is Caribbean and underbanked, unbanked populations. And the next one is the Caribbean's relationship to the US and the dollar. So let's take the first one about underbanked and unbanked. Obviously, China's central bank digital currency is in the news all the time because it's a big country. But the first actual retail central bank digital currency was in the island of the Bahamas. Technically not quite the Caribbean, but close enough, all right?
Right.
But what's really important is that the Bahamas CBDC shows what good a central bank digital currency can do for a smaller place and an island nation. Because look, Bahamas has many small islands. You can't put a bank on every island. It's not possible, right?
Right.
By going to a digital currency, you can provide savings, banking services, and basic money management without ever having to build a bank. I always say that the CBDC for the Bahamas is small in size, but it's got the heart of a lion or a tiger because it really does what technology is supposed to do, which is help improve people's lives.
Correct.
So then you've got the Bahamas following on them. You've got the Eastern Caribbean nations, Nevis, and their 8 little islands. They're all connected there. They are in the Caribbean. Yeah. And they're trialing a new CBDC called D-Cash for digital cash. All of these are bringing financial inclusion to Caribbean islands where it's just really hard to put banks. There's not a lot of money, so you can't put a bank on every island or in every community, and digital, a great way to accomplish this. That's sort of the issue of financial inclusion for unbanked populations in the Caribbean. And 2 of the early CBDCs are in the Caribbean, and it's not an accident.
And I think that's what we really wanted to highlight in the first video as well, is the need for that, because it does help so many people that are underbanked or people that are living in remote areas. And I think that's what we've seen in China as well. I mean, China is a very large country, some very vast areas that people always have access. So again, this is why the central bank digital currency is so important why China is investing in this. And I think I remember in our last episode, almost every country around the world has initiated either a research project or are starting to develop, pretty much most countries around the world are interested in this concept and are doing some initial research on this.
Oh, yeah. It's something like 80% of the central banks in the planet now are actively rolling out research or trials. And but interestingly, the most advanced of them are actually in the Asia region. So we look at Japan, Korea, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, Thailand. All of them are very active with central bank digital currency programs, which really puts Asia as a real leader in the CBDC game when you look at it on a global scale, because they have large unbanked populations. Here's the takeaway from this. When we look back, let's go 100 years in the future, and we're going to look back at this period with central bank digital currencies being launched. In 100 years, the biggest thing that central bank digital currencies will be known for, what they'll be famous for, what they'll be remembered for, will be bringing financial inclusion to unbanked populations. And that's really the take home that people really have to understand about CBDC. That's where it's probably where it will definitely make the biggest impact on a historical scale. Looking back.
That's fantastic. And my question is, as we're looking at this Caribbean area, the United States has dominated the banking, area there. I mean, they've been very influential there. But what we've seen recently is the United States is actually pulling out of that area. And I think this is a big trend. And a big thing is really de-risking. Can you tell us a little bit about, what is de-risking and why is the United States banks pulling out of the Caribbean region?
Sure. And that's a great question. So the Caribbean is really a microcosm for the fundamental question of why will other countries use the digital RMB, or why will countries even use the normal RMB for trade? It's really common for people in the US to think, well, US banks are big, they're all over the place. And that's true to a degree. So we can look at the Caribbean. Look at the Caribbean as a microcosm. Each one of these little islands is a country. They have their own governments. And what has happened since 9/11, something that's called de-risking. Banks don't like risk. So when they remove risk, they, quote, de-risk. And the risk that they're trying to eliminate is the risk that they do business with money launderers or bad people.
Correct.
All right. So drug running, money laundering, illegal cash transfers of some form or another. So what many of the US banks have done is to simply close their operations in the Caribbean. Right. So what you find now is that the Caribbean has Canadian banks, but frankly, in most Caribbean countries, there are no longer representatives of US banks there, which presents a problem. Because here's the funny thing. The Caribbean, if you look at their trade statistics, buy most of their goods from the United States. It's sort of funny because what they're really doing is they're importing Chinese-made goods through the United States. They come through Long Beach, California port, and and they take whatever route and they get to the Caribbean. When the US banks close, it makes doing business in US dollars with the United States more expensive. You ask the fundamental question, and this is a good one. And people say, well, why? Why would I use the digital yuan? Why would I use the digital RMB, however you want to call it?
Right.
Why would we use this to conduct trade with China when we have dollars? And the answer is, for many developing nations, go to Africa, go to South America, go to the Caribbean, for many small countries, because of bank de-risking, dollars are not easy to get. And there is a cost associated with doing dollar-based business that the digital RMB will likely decrease. So if it's cheaper to do business with China using a digital RMB, you'll do it. You'll take, most people will just go for the cheapest way to do anything. So the Caribbean is really an interesting, I call it a microcosm of the bigger question, who's going to use the RMB, the digital RMB, and why?
Correct. Well, I think it's important there that you brought up a really good point as well, is that we look at the United States as the number one exporter to the Caribbean region. However, like you said, most of those products are actually made in China. And so you could essentially eliminate this middleman. And I think this is what, you know, like you said, there's a vacuum that's been created with all of these United States banks leaving. This is a great opportunity for China to come in and to build better relationships in the region. Again, most of the products that they're buying is manufactured and made in China. And then now you're looking at, you know, well, we can launch a Chinese digital RMB. We can use that to directly trade with China. It could be a very worthwhile endeavor, for these countries in the Caribbean to do.
Absolutely. And that's why you see China improving port facilities. They had a deal with the Bahamas after the hurricane. They have what's called a direct currency swap arrangement with the country of Guyana.
Okay.
And all through the Caribbean basin, you see Chinese companies starting to come in and trying to make improvements to infrastructure. It's a changing world. We're picking this example of the Caribbean. It's not like it's just us saying this. The IMF has issued many, many papers about this, and they use a great example. They say basically when you lose these banks, these local U.S. banks in these foreign countries, it's like losing airline connections. You can't fly directly from your country to this other country. So therefore, you have to go through a third-party country to fly to the U.S. or fly wherever, and it costs more. It's a known problem that the IMF, World Bank, has been talking about. It really goes to the issue of, well, the dollar is the largest in trade, no question about it, not even a moment that we're going to question that. But what we can start to question is it the easiest currency for many developing countries to use and access? And the answer is no. Now, why is that? Banks want to de-risk because of what's called AML, anti-money laundering regulation. Let's be clear, China has these too. So what's happened is these regulations, which make banks responsible, are fundamentally good. We don't want bad money going through our financial system.
Correct.
That's a good thing. Nobody argues that.
Correct.
However, the laws are tremendously ineffective. According to the latest estimates, banks spend around $180 billion a year, AML, anti-money laundering regulations, and they capture less than 0.2, 0.3% of all of the money laundering in the planet. So they're not working very well.
Jeez.
Now, the problem is that they cost a lot. They don't work so well, and they make it so that honest people in developing nations can't get banking services. So they're tremendously regressive and need to be revised. They're probably very much problematic. Into this world comes the digital RMB.
Right.
So for anybody thinking, oh, well, China will just let money go wherever it wants. Oh, absolutely not.
Correct.
China will have anti-money laundering, but more importantly, they will have a digitally controlled currency. So believe me, if you're a drug runner, the last currency you're going to want to move money with will be the digital RMB. The funny thing is the normal banking system moves most of the money that's dirty. We're used to thinking about movies maybe where you have a suitcase full of $100 bills. And, that's how it's shown in a lot of the gangster movies. Well, nobody uses that anymore. You have shell companies, all of these different hidden entities that allow money to transfer through the banking system legally because we don't know where the money is coming and going from. So the answer is the problem is never likely to go away, but it can be probably better controlled through digital currency transfers. We need to be more mindful that the developing world is not cut off from fun. So we're basically cutting off a lot of honest people who want to do business in dollars or with whatever currency. But the bad guys are still getting through. So we really need to reevaluate this entire system. But it speaks to the very issue. People, when I talk to them about the digital RMB, some people get very upset. They're like, who wants to hold the digital RMB? Who wants any RMB?
Right.
Who's going to use that? And the reality is there are many of these developing countries that really will be happy to use the digital RMB if it's cheap and effective because they're cut off from dollars.
Absolutely. Well, I think the other thing that we've seen is, I've seen some graphs that, indicates, just how much the world has shifted in the last few decades. For example, in the 1970s and 80s, the United States was the #1 exporter for many countries around the world. And then you fast forward to 2020, the last graph that I saw, and you just see a very big shift in now that it is China that is dominating, in many countries around the world. I mean, I think it really makes a lot of sense that obviously as more and more countries are developing a closer relationship with China. The Belt and Road Initiative has been tremendously successful. We often hear about the Belt and Road Initiative and maybe hear some negative things. A lot of people don't realize how many trillions of dollars have already passed through that system in trade, and that, there's been a lot of success stories already accomplished with Belt and Road. And I think, this is an interesting statistic, Richard, that I wanted to highlight here, is when we talk about the correspondent banking relationships. And there is the number of Chinese CBRs, correspondent banking relationships, has increased globally from 65 in 2009 to 2,246 in 2016. Now that's already 5 years old. So, you can imagine that that's probably well increased. And I think that just shows the need. I mean, obviously, if China is opening more of these relationships with banks and countries around the world, there's more countries around the world that are going to wanting to be developing. And I think when you're a tiny nation in the Caribbean, for example, I know Barbados has been having a very strong relationship with China. Their prime minister has reached out and has really developed a great relationship, from trade to vaccines, here with COVID, and all relationships. And I think this is what we're going to see moving forward, especially from these smaller nations. You don't want to just depend on the United States. I think ideally you'd want to have a good relationship with both US and China.
Oh, look, absolutely. And, if the US has been remiss in anything in the past, 15, 20 years, it's been that a lot of these developing nations have been somewhat forgotten about.
Yeah.
And, that's so, the U.S. now wants to work with the G7 and put together what's called Build Back Better program on a global scale. I think that's wonderful.
Right.
No problem. I think it's great. But the reality is, for many years, many of these nations have been not just forgotten about, but actually cut off from the U.S. financial system. If you're not actively building infrastructure there, and then you cut off the banking ties, it's very, where and what can these nations do? That's why something like the digital RMB is so potentially powerful for them, because it gives them a way to potentially use a digital currency that allows them to pay for whatever imports they want to import from China within minutes.
Correct. Yeah,
it's not a matter of days. Wait for the check to clear. No, it's bang. It's going to hit you. You convert to digital RMB. You buy with digital RMB. It clears customs electronically. By the way, this is a great news piece that was just in the Wall Street Journal.
Okay.
About Alibaba going for 72-hour shipping.
I saw that.
Yeah. I can't remember. It was something like. It was a better part, like 70, 80 countries in the world. It was really big.
That's right.
But they're taking on Amazon. It's mind-blowing.
Absolutely. They're taking on. And I think with this digital renminbi is going to be a big part. And I think, again, as both of us are Americans, I think this is something that we're going to have to see from America, is we're going to see China becoming more influential in the region. But again, that was a result of the United States cutting off these banking ties. And I think sometimes even America might have the attitude of, well, when we look at our global trade and the Caribbean region is maybe just a very small part, a very much less than 1%. So it's maybe not an important one. Maybe we want to focus on bigger relationships. But when you see China building up all of these developing countries around the world, throughout Africa, the continent of Africa, and then the Caribbean region, this starts to become a very valuable sum of countries when you start adding them up together.
Cyrus, that's really a wonderful comment. And look, I don't mean to say, and I think it's important to get out, there's no disaster. When an American bank looks at its business in the Caribbean, it's a rounding error for them. More expensive for them to keep the office open than based on what they make. I get that. The Caribbean is affectionately called America's backyard. To me, it's what I call a canary in the coal mine. The proverbial canary was in the coal mine to be a warning for CO2 exposure for miners. It was a real thing. The Caribbean is a canary in the coal mine. It may be a story that you haven't followed. It may seem a little bit out there.
Well,
but it matters, because in 3 or 4 years, when people say, oh, we're really surprised that the digital RMB is taking off in whatever country, don't be surprised. Look at the Caribbean. Look at countries that have been taken out of the American banking system because of de-risking. Look at them today, because they're the canary in the coal mine. They're telling us what's going to happen sometime in the future. So there's no need to be surprised. This is a microcosm for what's happening throughout developing countries. And most of these developing countries are BRI countries. And most of them will use digital RMB very happily. Add them all up, and you're going to get a big number.
Well, Richard, we're going to end on this one point that you just made there. As the United States is saying, look, it costs us more money to physically put a bank there, to staff it, to cover our expenses. That's exactly why the digital RMB is created, because that eliminates all of that, right? And that is what is so important about this. And like you said, this is really maybe it's a story that we're kind of covering a few years too early. But, I think this is going to say, we can look back on this in a few years when the Caribbean has this digital RMB, when there's more payments going through, when there's more trade going through. And I think this is great for China, obviously, pioneering this technology. But again, it goes down to when you're building these relationships on the Belt and Road Initiative, and you're building and you're launching a digital currency, you're helping. Digital currencies at the end of the day are helping people that are underbanked, and they're helping them have a better life. And that's what's really important here. Any other comments, Richard, you want to end on?
Oh, I have a great idea for us, Cyrus. Here's what we should do. In a couple of years' time, when we both read that newspaper article that says, I'm so surprised to see this Caribbean nation using the digital RMB. What a shocker. That's America's backyard. We should pull out this video and do a video rehash where we, take snippets of this video with the new one at that time.
Sounds good. Let's do it in a couple of years. Maybe
we'll do that one in however long it takes, right?
That sounds good.
There's a lot to follow here. But if people are asking that fundamental question, why will anyone use the digital RMB? The answers are there if you look a little bit. And you really have to go look at these developing countries, because they need help, and they need a cheap and efficient way to transact business. And the dollar for them is no longer cheap and efficient.
Fantastic.
That's the reality.
Richard, I want to thank you so much. Again, you were one of the experts on China's central bank digital currency. For everybody, I want to thank you for watching our episode today. Make sure you scan the QR code that is on right next to Richard. That is actually the cover of his book. It is Cashless, China's Digital Currency Revolution. Make sure you scan that, or you can click down below to buy a copy of your book. It's a great book, and if you're interested, if you've made it to this point in the video, you no doubt are interested about China's digital currency. And again, this is going to be something that will be part of our globe. It's something that we should be informed about. And Richard and his book is a great resource for all of you. Richard, thank you so much for again joining me, and I can't wait to see you in another episode.
Cyrus, thank you so much. Everybody out there, connect with me on LinkedIn. I write about this stuff all the time. And Cyrus, thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be with you on your show.
Thank you so much.